With that, we'll move on to our next topic, which is all around measuring what matters. OS is a foundation for modern KPIs. And for that, we have Chet Carlson. Chet is the lead production system analyst for Factory Physics and its parent company, Strategic Project Solutions. He's responsible for leading production system analysis and optimization efforts to map, model, simulate, analyze, and optimize permanent and temporary production systems. Chet has worked with numerous organizations across oil and gas, renewables, civil, manufacturing. He works with these corporations to identify and quantify opportunities to improve performance, including cycle time compression, cost reduction, improved utilization and cash, doing more with less. Chet brings extensive experience in educating and training others in the optimization of production systems. So Chet, look forward to what you have to offer for us.
Thanks, Gary. Let me go ahead and share my screen. Oops.
All right, we can see it.
Good. All right, let's get started. So this concept of a production system was mentioned briefly at the beginning of the day, but I want to return to it because it's important to recognize the importance of production system, and especially when we think about the current measurements used in the project world, most of them are corresponding to the left side of this picture. Very few measurements in practice actually are consistent with the world of production. And so if we take a look at some of the more popular metrics from a traditional project management perspective, it's pretty clear to see that most of them are financial in nature. And that's actually what they were intended for in the first place. They were designed for accounting, for forecasting, for reporting. And it's not to say that these measurements are wrong in any way. Project teams need to measure progress. They need to forecast dates and cost, and they need to be able to provide schedule and budget variances to keep different trades accountable based on their contractual obligations. But they're limited from the perspective of actually understanding and controlling production systems. If you find yourself in the unfortunate scenario that these 6 project teams were involved in, it's pretty clear from each of these curves that something's wrong. But using the traditional project management measurements, it's not clear what the project team should do next to correct course. And so this is apparent, as you can tell, at least for these 6 project teams, and what we see across many other projects. The measurements aren't good at telling project teams what to do, and you can see that by the point when the project starts to slip, it continues to go south and it doesn't correct course. And so ultimately the point, what these different measurements should tell you is the ability to answer questions like the ones you see here. Now, these specific questions are just a few of many, but these enable project teams to identify and solve production-related problems that are often the cause of the behavior you see in the S-curves I just showed. And so some of these are like, what is the bottleneck of my production system and where is it? And is it in the right location? Or does it have enough capacity to meet the demand that's dictated by the schedule? When it comes to the variability that the project is experiencing, what are the sources of variability and where are they impacting the system the most? What part of the system is overloaded, if it is even, or is it being impacted by some other upstream process? Really important question that if you've been following PPI for any amount of time is the concept of WIP. And do we have too many work fronts open? And do we even know what that quantity should be? How much WIP should we have in the system? What's too much? What's too little? And when it comes to handing over work from one trade to the next, how much work should be handed over from one group to the next? So ultimately, we're not measuring entirely what we should be. And so it's the aim of this paper to add to the current measurement framework so that we can control production, not just observe it. So the way to do this is quite simple. you need to first select metrics that are tied to an informed decision-making on a project. Next, you have to collect the information. You have to analyze it and give insight to a system that can actually interact with the production system and control the behavior of it and identify when you actually need to step in and intervene. So we're going to run through each one of these. Now, the first and most important step in designing an effective measurement system is to begin with the end in mind. What is it that you're trying to achieve? You have to start by selecting the correct metrics, and it can be done by answering these 4 questions. Metrics must support operational and strategic goals, not just reporting obligations. Too often, organizations inherit metrics from the financial systems, like we saw before. And so it's also important to recognize that when measurements are misaligned with the purpose, it drives the wrong behaviors. So start with understanding, what does success look like for your project, your organization, both operationally and financially, and breaking down the different variables that control those outcomes. Making sure we encourage the right behavior with the metrics that we choose, and understanding, what are we trying to optimize for? And then finally, what decisions need to be made by quickly, and how quickly, and by whom. So when you select metrics, at least from a production standpoint, we have the following criteria. They need to be scientifically validated to describe production system behavior. It's probably the most important one. But equally important, I'd say, actually, is that they need to trigger a decision when a particular measurement goes within range or without a range, depending on what that is. And they also need to be able to optimize or enhance performance consistent with the organization's objectives. So when you're choosing modern KPIs, it's important to understand that they need a balance of both leading and lagging indicators. Lagging indicators are retrospective in nature. They reflect the outcome after it's already happened, and they're typically used for reporting, accountability, and confirmation. Things like, if we keep a simple everyday example, or hopefully not every day, but a thermometer to check your temperature. Whereas leading indicators are predictive in nature, and they change before the outcome or events they're meant to signal. They enable proactive intervention, and you can think of leading indicators like the thermostat you use to control your air conditioning in your home. They change if it's on auto. They turn the system on before it gets too hot or cold and keep things at an equilibrium. Now, descriptive, on the right-hand side, it's also important to consider the maturity of the metrics you're choosing. Descriptive and diagnostic metrics are inherently lagging, while predictive and prescriptive are more leading in nature. And while it's important to know what happened and why it happened, it's more important to know, as we look to increase the performance of our projects, what's going to happen next and how do we make sure it will happen. So from a production standpoint, this is a non-exhaustive list, but a few important ones that should be used to control production systems. So when we're thinking about controlling flow through a production system, we want to understand, what's the demand, what is the throughput of our production system, and how are the two related? Is there enough throughput to meet demand? If there isn't, then we have an issue. Also, what's the capacity of the production system? What's the utilization of your capacity, work in process in the system, cycle times, meaning how long does it take for work to actually get through the system, batch sizes we mentioned previously. And then when it comes to understanding variability, what are the things that are degrading the performance of your project? Is that associated with your process times, with arrival or release rates? And how often are the different sources of variability affecting your project? So we're going to use a very simple production process here to illustrate a couple of these performance metrics. This is a actual real case that we've sort of simplified for this conversation, but it captures a production process for pipe spools, that are being installed in a pipe rack. They move through a certain sequence of steps, and depending on the difference in their makeup, meaning material, diameter, and so on, they go through either a NDE and post-weld heat treat process or just an NDE process, or maybe they just need visual test. Now, if we consider taking a look at the demand on this production system, meaning how many pipe spools in this case are needed out of the system to meet a particular target from the schedule, versus the throughput of this, which is the rate that's actually observed of completed pipe spools coming out of the system. Comparing the two reveals over or under production, in this case, underproduction, and this would flag immediately that, hey, we need to increase capacity in our production system. Otherwise, we're going to be late. If we think about capacity utilization, what this does is it reveals the production system's bottleneck and opportunities to accelerate. So in this case, the fitters are the bottleneck. And so if that's the case, we want to ensure that, number one, should the fitters be the bottleneck? And two, are we comfortable with what happens at 93.75 or 94% utilization? Do we need to accelerate? And if we do, then they're going to have to be the first capacity contributor that we need to address. If you track cycle time, which represents the total time it takes for, in this case, a pipe spool to go through this process, it breaks down the proportions of each of these components and reveals the root causes that might be contributing to some of that S-curve behavior you saw before. If we're not comfortable with a pipe spool taking 500 hours to get through the system, we need to make changes. And where you make changes first, or in this case, are the blue area and the orange area, which correspond to queue time and batch time. And so without actually measuring this information and having a system that can actually do it, you may not know where to focus your efforts first to improve performance. Now, some of these measurements that I just mentioned are emergent properties of execution, which makes them more observational in nature rather than predictive, but their utility changes based on when they're measured and how they're used. Take variability, for example. It reflects historical behavior, but also reveals patterns that drive future instability. And so with that future instability in mind, you can move from a descriptive to diagnostic inputs that support decision-making. Now, if you combine these measurements with production system models or digital twins, you can actually turn most of these lagging metrics into leading predictors of future behavior. Digital twins and production system models can enable organizations to test mitigation scenarios, establish dynamic control limits, and predict performance before the work has even started. This brings us to the next step in this framework, which is collecting and analyzing the metrics that you've defined. Whether you're modeling work before it begins or concurrently executing work, data must come from work execution. We are discussing production-based measurements after all. So when it comes to the frequency of measuring information, it's best that it's done daily because execution happens on a daily basis. If you let too much time go on, you lose number one, responsiveness, and you might not capture all of the variability in the system that's present if you let things go weeks and months at a time without collecting information. And so if you were to move to a daily measurement process, it's pretty quickly you can see that projects can generate a massive amount of information. And so while you need the information, you also need a system that's capable of collecting and processing that information and making real-time decisions if needed. Because at the end of the day, raw data doesn't improve performance, actions do. So you need something to tell you in real time whether or not you need to make a change. And manually piecing together task completions, progress reports, trends, it can be overwhelming. Fortunately, there are solutions that exist to collect and process vast amounts of data and provide actionable insights in real time. Now, this brings us to the final step in this measurement framework, which is actually using the information from the chosen metrics to control the systems that deliver your projects. And so we've talked a lot about, we'll spend the last few minutes talking about selecting measurements that encourage some desired behavior, defining how we want the system to behave. Where we go next is ensuring that we actually get the behavior. And so this is really around the concept of control, which we define as the action of regulating or limiting behavior of processes in a production system. Enabling control in a production environment is the entire purpose of this measurement framework. So let's consider the same pipe installation example. What was done here is we analyzed this production system and able to define first of all, understand what the performance of the system would look like if we're once it becomes up and running. And so we can tell that based on the demand here, which is this horizontal green line, we need about 6 pipe spools per day. That purple curve that's increasing and flattening out tells us how much throughput we get if we start to add work into the system. And so as you go to install more pipe spools, you need to get at minimum up to this level of 300 in order to have your throughput cross that line. But we don't necessarily want to only have 300 spools in the system, because if you do that, then 50% of the time you may have less, which is going to make you fall back on your throughput curve and not meet your demand. And 50% of the time you might have more. And so we really want to avoid falling under the 300 mark, because if we do, what that means is that we'll start to fall behind. So what we need is, the other thing here too is this blue line represents that if we just let the system run as is, this would be the amount of WIP we'd have in the system on average. And so there's a pretty big gap between the two lines here. And why we don't necessarily want to pick the blue one, which is about 450 spools in WIP, is because although it maintains the demand that you need, it has a higher cycle time that's necessary, which is captured by that orange curve. And so what we want to do here is identify a policy to limit the amount of WIP, so we don't extend all the way to 450, but we maintain somewhere above 300. So we might pick, for example, a policy right here at about 310. And this WIP control policy is something that we call CONWIP, which means constant work in process. If we observe what happens to the system over time, you can see that WIP will actually increase up to about 500 before it starts to flatten out. But if we implement this policy to control WIP, then you hover around on the right-hand side here at 310, which really means that I'm keeping track of how much WIP is in the system. And if I'm at my threshold, I'm not going to allow my teams to start more work. I'm going to keep it. And then as soon as that falls down, then I can start more work. So you're constantly on a daily basis managing how much work is in the system and how do I keep it at that level. And it's just about saying yes or no to releasing more work. Now, the benefit here is that you go from an average cycle time of about 80.67 days to just above 51 days. So it's a 37% improvement at no additional cost. And you get the behavior that you want out of the system. And so we'll end the conversation here on this. The way we measure performance fundamentally shapes how we manage it. And I think it was Mark that mentioned earlier that the industry needs to go from measuring what's easy and familiar to measuring something that's actually important to manage. And while traditional project metrics remain valuable for contractual and financial purposes, they were never really designed to reflect the realities of dynamic production systems. And so by adding a production-based framework, project teams can be better equipped to understand and change the behavior of their production systems in real time. And I will leave it at that. Open it up for questions.
All right. So now I'm going to chew on the audience a bit. Come on. That didn't elicit any ideas or questions from any of you? All 67 of you participating? Somebody's got, okay, here we go. Got a brave soul. You mentioned the question, is the bottleneck where it should be? How do these conversations play out? Is the desire to have the bottleneck where there is excess capacity? Or it says access capacity. I think that meant excess capacity.
So I guess it comes down to, well, I can give you a certain scenario, one scenario. Um, let's say you have a very expensive piece of equipment. If you have the bottleneck being maybe the resources that will release work to that expensive piece of equipment, and you have a utilization of that equipment at like 50%, that's probably going to throw some some warning signals to the financial side of the project, that you have a piece of equipment that's only being used 50% of the time. So in certain scenarios, you might want to have your very expensive equipment not maybe more highly utilized, from a financial perspective. But at the end of the day, it's your choice. You can make the decision of where you want the bottleneck. I hope that answers the question.
Yeah, so kind of building on that, how do you decide where you want the bottleneck? Is it an iterative process?
Well, having the bottleneck in the middle of a production system versus the beginning of it versus the end, it does have implications on the performance. And so you can actually quantify, the the um, the benefit of having it at the beginning or the end of a production system, using different modeling and optimization tools. So it can be quantified.
Yeah.
Yes, this is James. Can I add something there?
Sure.
Yeah. So I think regarding the bottleneck, again, our definition of bottleneck is it is the resource with the highest average utilization, capacity utilization.
Mhm.
So the question is, which resource do we want to keep the busiest, right? As Chet said, it could be a very expensive piece of equipment, or it could be the crew that we have the least excess capacity for. So, for example, if we actually have welders that are highly skilled welders that are very hard to come by, and we have limited amount of them on the project, we want to make sure that we get the best utilization out of that crew. Therefore, we want to make them the bottleneck, right? And one other thing that I think Chad talked about a little bit is the location of the bottleneck. As he talked about the importance of limiting the WIP into the system, if you have the bottleneck at the front of your production system, it actually almost becomes a self-regulating because the work that's actually flowing into the production process is limited by your bottleneck rate. So therefore, placing it at the front actually gives you additional benefit of being able to easily control the amount of WIP in the system.
Really good point.
Thanks,
So we
James.
got another question here. Do you believe that in project production management, predictive metrics should be prioritized over reactive ones, or do both play a complementary role at different levels of decision making?
I think I think they're both important, and I would follow up with a question of what the asker of the question means by reactive measurements. But I think it's important to know both where you're going and what can be done to make it happen. And two, while you're actually executing work, you need to know where things are, right? So you're tracking what's actually happening so you can make changes if needed. You really have to have both. You can't just have predictive, because then when you actually get to that point in time, you need to know what's going on. So you need to have both.
So go back to the prior slide. Let me build
Yep.
on that for a second. Yeah, that one. So the belief around KPIs is they're key performance indicators, meaning there's an underlying belief that by measuring those things, we will get performance, that those are the levers of performance. And the work, my understanding of production management and where I've grown to now leads me to believe that some of the KPIs that we historically use are actually deleterious to the project. Would you share that view, and which ones would you point out that might be the worst?
Well, um, One that comes to mind is maybe around labor productivity. Maximizing the productivity of your labor, which really comes down to earned hours, comes down from an earned versus burned hours perspective. If you maximize the productivity of certain crews, certain resources on a project, you might be starting too much work in the wrong areas. If you're not, so they don't really tell you exactly. So labor productivity doesn't really tell you exactly if you're working on the right work at a given point in time. But if you're trying to increase your productivity for the sake of increasing productivity, you may actually open up work fronts across the project that could actually increase cycle times and cause you further delays downstream. That's just the first one that comes to mind.
I personally would agree with you. That's what I've concluded as well. When I implemented corporate level productivity metrics for all our projects, my former life, I didn't realize how bad we were shooting ourselves in the foot and the unintended consequences of people gaming those metrics. And our whip just blew up. We had no idea that's what we were doing to ourselves. So it's a baddie, and mostly EVM metrics that go along with it.
Mm-hmm.
My personal point of view. Okay, any other questions from the audience? Come on. You guys got to have some questions. Sit here with that awkward silence for a minute. We've got to put you guys in order. No? Well, I would encourage everybody to really take a hard look at the metrics you're using and grab Chet's paper and start implementing some predictive metrics that are going to be useful for control of the project instead of those rear view metrics that are months old. You think you've got a handle on driving, but it's like driving a Sherman tank with the pedal down full throttle, but you're looking in the rear view mirror and it just does not work. So Chet, you raise a really good body of knowledge here, and I hope our audience grabs it and uses it.
Me too.
Thank you.
Thanks.